Pressure was the through line today. On the field, the World Cup gave North America exactly the kind of host nation momentum organizers dreamed about. The United States advancing, Canada erupting, Mexico already through. But even those celebrations came with a cost. Injuries, red cards, and the reminder that a global tournament is not just a sporting event. It is a civic stress test. On the golf course, Shinnecock Hills did what Shinnecock Hills tends to do. It exposed nerves, patience, and discipline. Joaquin Neiman's penalty for serious misconduct became one of the early defining moments of the U.S. Open, while major names fell away before the weekend. And in politics, several institutions were tested at once: alliances, intelligence leadership, military posture, presidential ethics, and public trust. From a diplomatic rift with Italy to questions around Air Force One, from NATO tensions to a fragile Iran track, the week's political news carried a common theme. Control is easy to claim, much harder to demonstrate. This is your top stories wrap-up for Saturday, June 20th, 2026. I'm your host, and today we're looking at a news cycle where spectacle met pressure. In sports, in government, and in the public institutions investors and citizens both depend on. Let's start with the World Cup, because for all the chaos elsewhere, this is still the cleanest and most emotionally powerful story of the day. The United States is into the knockout round after beating Australia 2-0 at Lumen Field in Seattle. The win mattered on the scoreboard, obviously, but it mattered even more because the U.S. did it without Christian Pulisic, who missed the match with a calf injury. That is not a small detail. Pulisic is still the most recognizable attacking player in the American men's program, the player casual fans know, the one opponents plan for. So a comfortable win without him changes the interpretation of this U.S. team. It suggests depth, it suggests tactical flexibility, and it suggests that this group may not be as dependent on one star as previous American teams sometimes appeared to be. Alex Freeman, the 21-year-old defender and son of former Green Bay Packers receiver Antonio Freeman, scored his first World Cup goal, giving the match one of those cross-sport American storylines that television producers love and fans remember. But the real investor-style read is this: U.S. soccer is trying to prove it has moved from personality-driven growth to system-driven growth. A win without Pulisic is evidence in that direction. Not proof, but evidence. Canada's day was more complicated. Canada beat Qatar 6-0 in Vancouver, with Jonathan David scoring a hat-trick and the country recording its first-ever World Cup victory. That sentence alone should have been enough to define the day in Canadian soccer history. The match is likely to be remembered just as much for Ismail Kone's broken leg after a challenge by Qatar's Asim Madibo, who was sent off. Qatar finished with 9 men, so Canada got the breakthrough, but at a steep human and tactical cost. Kone is not just another midfielder. He is part of the generation that has helped make Canada feel like a serious footballing country rather than a proud underdog. Losing him changes the emotional tone around the team and could alter the way Canada manages matches from here. Mexico, meanwhile, became the first team to reach the last 32 after a 1-0 win over South Korea. Paraguay beat Turkey 1-0, a result that eliminated Turkey, while Miguel Almiron's red card under FIFA's new mouth-covering rule gave the tournament a disciplinary milestone that will almost certainly be debated. That rule is worth pausing on. It is designed to stop players from hiding what they say to opponents or officials by covering their mouths. In theory, it is about transparency and abuse prevention. In practice, at a World Cup, any new rule becomes part of the drama. The question now is whether officials apply it consistently, because inconsistency is what turns a rules adjustment into a controversy. Beyond the matches, the co-hosting experiment is becoming a civic story. Seattle handled large crowds, heavy transit use, and fan zones. Philadelphia's Brazil-Haiti match turned the area around Lincoln Financial Field into a street-level celebration of Brazilian and Haitian identity. Boston's influx of Scotland supporters stretched hospitality operators. Southern California's Mexican and Korean communities turned match days into shared cultural events. Iranian fans at SoFi Stadium brought political symbolism into the stands alongside national support. That's the larger point. This World Cup is not just moving through North American cities. It is revealing them. Their transit systems, their policing strategies, their hospitality capacity, their diaspora politics, their ability to manage celebration without losing control. For investors, that has a business angle. Mega events can lift hotels, restaurants, airlines, merchandise sales, media rights, and local advertising, but they also expose infrastructure bottlenecks and labor constraints. A packed fan zone is good for revenue. A transit breakdown or security failure can become a reputational cost overnight. Now, from the roar of the World Cup to the quiet cruelty of Shinnecock Hills, the U.S. Open turned sharply around Joaquin Niemann's first round. On the sixth hole, after two tee shots out of bounds and another into native area, Niemann initially made a 9. The USGA later added a two-stroke penalty for serious misconduct after he threw a club, moving the score to 11 on the hole and pushing his opening round to 8 over 78. That is the kind of moment that becomes bigger than the number. Golf markets itself on self-control, etiquette, and emotional discipline under pressure. A major championship at Shinnecock already comes with an expectation of punishment. Add a conduct penalty, and suddenly the story is not just shot-making, it is composure. The course itself has been part of the debate. Early criticism suggested the setup may have been too forgiving for Shinnecock, a course famous for severity and volatility. But by Friday, the championship had started to look more like a U.S. Open again. Wyndham Clark carried the lead into the weekend, with Matt Fitzpatrick joining him in the final Saturday pairing. Justin Thomas and Xander Schauffele remained within reach. The setup now creates the classic U.S. Open question. Can the leader keep absorbing punishment, or will the course drag everybody back toward par? That is why this tournament is compelling even when scoring looks ugly. The U.S. Open is not built to reward comfort. It is built to test decision-making under stress. In that sense, Shinnecock is not so different from the political stories of the week. In Washington, the week's friction started with a diplomatic embarrassment that may prove more consequential than it first sounded. President Trump's relationship with Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni deteriorated publicly after Meloni rejected his claim that she had begged him for a photograph at the G7 summit. Italian Foreign Minister Antonio Tajani canceled a planned U.S. trip and described the remarks as serious and offensive. On the surface, this sounds personal. A dispute over a photo, a bruised ego, a headline that disappears in a day or two. But the interpretation is broader. Meloni has often been described as one of Trump's closest ideological counterparts in Europe. If even that relationship is fraying in public, it raises questions about how durable U.S. alliances are under pressure. And this is not happening in a vacuum. NATO, Iran, the Strait of Hormuz, defense spending, and European security are all live issues. Markets do not usually move on a single diplomatic insult, but investors do pay attention to alliance cohesion. Energy markets care about the Strait of Hormuz. Defense companies care about NATO spending and procurement. Multinationals care about geopolitical predictability. So the question is not whether one remark matters. The question is whether the remark is a symptom of a broader operating style. Inside Washington, the intelligence community faced its own disruption. Trump shortened Tulsi Gabbard's tenure as Director of National Intelligence and moved to install Bill Pulte, head of the Federal Housing Finance Agency, as acting DNI, while delaying the path for nominee Jay Clayton. The concern, as reported, is experience. The Director of National Intelligence oversees an 18-agency intelligence apparatus. It is a coordination role, a credibility role, and in moments of crisis, a judgment role. Installing someone with limited intelligence experience may be legal, depending on the process, but legality and confidence are not the same thing. That distinction matters. Institutions run not only on rules, but on trust. If career officials, lawmakers, allies, and markets believe leadership is unstable or politicized, decision-making can slow. Risk premiums can rise. Information can become harder to validate. Then there is Air Force One. The administration unveiled a converted, formerly Qatari-owned Boeing 747 to serve as Air Force One, prompting ethics and legality questions because of the aircraft's origin and value. The Pentagon says the aircraft was accepted in accordance with federal rules. That is the fact pattern as publicly presented. The interpretation is more contested. Critics see a troubling symbolic and ethical question. Supporters may frame it as a practical acquisition. Either way, the optics are powerful. Presidential aircraft are not just transportation. They are symbols of sovereignty, security, and continuity. When the origin of that symbol becomes controversial, the aircraft becomes a governance story. On defense policy, U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth used a Brussels meeting to rebuke NATO allies, and announce a Pentagon review of U.S. forces in Europe and allied performance. European officials pushed back by pointing to accelerated spending, procurement, and industrial production, particularly in drones, air defense, and long-range weapons. Here, the forward-looking issue is burden sharing. If Washington reduces its footprint in Europe, European governments may spend more on defense. That could benefit parts of the defense industrial base, especially in Europe, but it could also increase uncertainty around deterrence, logistics, and alliance planning. For markets, the risk is not simply more spending or less spending. It is the transition from one security architecture to another. The Iran track adds another layer. A tentative U.S.-Iran oil and ceasefire arrangement reportedly includes sanctions relief and a possible reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. But the key word is tentative. Oil flows do not normalize just because officials say they might. Buyers, insurers, shippers, banks, and regulators all need confidence. Infrastructure may be damaged. Spare capacity may be limited. Legal risk does not disappear overnight. So the fact is that a diplomatic pathway appears to be under discussion. The interpretation is that energy markets may price some relief if the Strait of Hormuz looks safer. The uncertainty is whether implementation can survive regional realities. Lebanon is one of those realities. Israel and Hezbollah agreed to a fragile ceasefire after renewed cross-border fighting. But reported Israeli strikes and civilian casualties show how quickly a pause can become temporary. If that front escalates again, it could complicate any broader U.S.-Iran understanding. At home, public accountability stories filled out the day. In Texas, a Collin County judge released evidence in the murder case of Carmelo Anthony, who was convicted and sentenced to 35 years for fatally stabbing 17-year-old Austin Metcalf during an altercation at a Frisco ISD track meet on April 2, 2025. A jury rejected Anthony's self-defense claim earlier this month. The Justice Department opened an inquiry into Major League Baseball's handling of 3 San Francisco Giants pitchers who wrote Bible verses on Pride Night caps. MLB had warned Landon Raup, J.T. Brubaker, and Ryan Walker for altering their uniforms. The inquiry centers on whether the league's response raised religious rights concerns. That puts a private sports league into a familiar national debate. Where do uniform rules end and personal expression begins? In South Carolina, authorities confirmed that a body found earlier in the week was Elena Catherine Moore, a 39-year-old fitness trainer missing since June 11th. Officials said the cause and manner of death remained pending. And in Washington, blue material was reported peeling and algae appeared at the Lincoln Memorial Reflecting Pool, only weeks after a roughly $14 million to $15 million renovation. President Trump attributed the damage to vandalism and said authorities were investigating. Scientists and maintenance observers pointed to familiar urban water problems: heat, runoff, and circulation. The cause remains a factual question. The public takeaway is simpler. Even the nation's most symbolic spaces require competent maintenance. The day also included a major civic milestone. The Obama Presidential Center opened to the public on Juneteenth, on Chicago's South Side. The campus includes a museum, a public library branch, athletic and community spaces, basketball courts, and picnic areas. The Obama Foundation has framed it not only as a presidential institution, but as a civic investment in the neighborhood where Barack Obama began his political career. The timing is deliberate. Juneteenth marks the 1865 announcement in Galveston, Texas, that enslaved Americans were free. Opening the center on that date places the legacy of the first Black president inside a broader national commemoration of emancipation, memory, and unfinished democratic work. There were cultural farewells too. Television lost James "Jimmy" Burrows, the director and co-creator associated with Cheers and major sitcoms including Taxi, Friends, and Will and Grace. His career helped define the pacing and rhythm of the modern multi-camera sitcom. In hockey, Jonathan Toews announced his retirement after 16 NHL seasons, closing a career most closely associated with 3 Chicago Blackhawks Stanley Cup championships in 2010, 2013, and 2015. His legacy is complicated by the broader history of that franchise, but on the ice, he was one of the defining two-way captains of his era. A few other notes round out the picture. Shohei Ohtani was scratched from the Dodgers lineup for paternity leave, as he and his wife awaited the birth of their second child, not because of a new injury. Tick-borne disease alerts in Oregon and Georgia renewed attention on summer prevention. checks after outdoor activity, knowing tick species, and watching for symptoms. In Texas agriculture, a New World screwworm case in a dog in Lubbock raised concern among pet owners and ranchers, with the state launching an information portal for detection and reporting. And in entertainment, Toy Story 5 opened with major box office momentum while leaning into darker themes: aging, technological displacement, and children's screen-centered lives. So where does this leave us? Over the next 24 to 48 hours, the World Cup will test whether host nation momentum can survive injuries, disciplinary controversies, and the pressure of expectation. The United States has depth to prove. Canada has emotion to manage. Mexico has an early advantage to protect. At Shinnecock Hills, the U.S. Open becomes a pressure chamber. Wyndham Clark, Matt Fitzpatrick, and the chasing pack are not just playing each other. They are playing the course, the wind, and the psychology of a major championship. In politics, the scenarios are sharper. One scenario is containment. The disputes over Italy, intelligence leadership, Air Force One, NATO, and Iran remain separate controversies. No single one becomes systemic. Markets digest the noise, institutions absorb the pressure, and policy keeps moving. A second scenario is accumulation. Each controversy reinforces the next, creating a perception that public institutions are being pulled into constant improvisation. That can weaken trust, complicate alliances, and raise uncertainty for investors. A third scenario is reversal. Diplomatic pressure could force clearer rules, stronger oversight, or more disciplined communication. In that case, the turbulence becomes corrective rather than corrosive. The closing takeaway is this: today's biggest stories were not only about who won, who lost, or who made a controversial decision. They were about stress tests. A World Cup stress test for cities and teams. A U.S. Open stress test for discipline. A political stress test for alliances and institutions. A civic stress test for public memory and public maintenance. Spectacle draws attention. Pressure reveals structure. And today, across sports, politics, and public life, the structure was very much on display.